you're competing with Google, and you want the best engineers, and so you have to take drastic steps to do that. So, for example, I am not the CEO anymore. I gave up that position, one, because it's kind of a multiplicative effect, and then second is that part of the condition of him becoming CEO is that he'd be retained for 4 years, and so that is, I think, a good deal on both sides. And I should mention that he was an intern this summer before he became CEO.
Hi, welcome to Engineering a Startup. I'm Akash Goyal, and today I'm talking to Serge Toarca, who's the founder and former CEO of a company called ParseHub. What ParseHub is it's basically a tool for web scraping. It can take a website and turn it into a spreadsheet, and there are all kinds of applications for this technology. As you probably already grasped from the intro, Serge is a super interesting guy. He struck me as being extremely practical about entrepreneurship and really about everything. His journey to ParseHub is really interesting. It started out as a company called DebugX, which he realized couldn't make any money, and before that he worked with a few friends to try create a hedge fund, which also didn't make any money. So he knows what it's like for things to not work, but it doesn't really stop him at all. He's used to things breaking all the time, and the question just becomes, how do you fix it? I really enjoyed this conversation with Serge. It's really interesting to hear how his company operates under a model he likes to call a benevolent dictatorship. So, without further ado, please welcome Serge.
My name is Serge Toarca. I founded a company called ParseHub, which I guess is how you found me.
Yep.
I stepped away from that, so I'm still working within the company, but I stepped away to work on a new product within that company about a year ago.
Okay.
And that's almost ready to launch. So pretty excited about both of those.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. So can you walk me through what is ParseHub and then what's the new product you're working on?
Sure. So ParseHub is essentially it's a tool for web scraping. So if you're an e-commerce site, it might be very useful to you to have like daily a spreadsheet of some other e-commerce sites that you're competing with, or that you want to get some market information about. But usually, those other sites don't want to, they don't want to give you those spreadsheets because that's valuable information for them.
Yeah.
And so, the way you do it is you go on their website, just the way a regular user would, and you extract the data.
Okay.
Yeah. So we basically take websites and turn them into spreadsheets for people.
Mm-hmm. And then do you provide tools for analyzing that, like once it's been parsed?
Not yet. So that's also something that we think is missing in the market. Mm-hmm. But that's not something that we provide yet.
Okay. And then what's the new product you're working on?
Sure. So it's a product to help increase the sales for ParseHub. So one of the things that we found was an issue was, for example, like when we are developing the tool, we are basically blind. So what we've done in the past is we've called people in for like user tests, mm-hmm. For them to sit down, and like we can basically sit behind their shoulder and ask them to do a task, and we watch what they do, and then they'll fall into some pit where like they couldn't figure out how to solve the task, mm-hmm. And then we kind of like do that iteratively, and every time they fall into a pit, we try to fix a pit and then bring in more people to watch.
Yeah.
But that is that it's super slow, right? So you have like all kinds of scheduling conflicts, as I'm sure you're aware of with podcasting. But it's like you can only bring in like maybe 5 or 6 people a week, because it's just like otherwise it's too hard. Each user test also takes a bunch of time, right? So it's like it takes maybe an hour or 2 of your time. Mm-hmm. If you count all the emailing back and forth and the actual time to sit down. And then the only value from the user test is maybe there's like 2 minutes that you're actually interested in.
Yeah.
That you really want to see, and the rest of it is basically a waste. Like you just have to go through it because you have to get them to the point where they fall into the hole.
Yeah.
And so it's like the super inefficient process, but you have to do it because otherwise your product, when people use it, they won't know how to use it. And then on top of that, they're not even real customers, right? So you bring in people, typically they're friends or people who are willing to give you an hour or 2 of their time. Mm-hmm. And so they don't have the same motivations as a customer would. They're never going to like go through your purchasing funnel to like put down their credit card.
Yeah.
They don't have a boss breathing down their neck. And so, they're not real customers. They're basically, customers in this pretend situation that you kind of try to simulate well enough that you can get some useful insight out of it.
Yeah.
And so what we want to do is basically make it so that it's not blind, so that we get basically like user testing feedback. Instead of saying, let's get 5 random people and walk them through this whole task, what I would like to be able to do is say, like, give me 5 people who like put stuff in their cart and then never completed the purchase.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Give me 30 people like that, because I only need to see 30 seconds of action before that to see what they were doing on the site. If you take 30 people times 30 seconds, that's only like 10 minutes or 15 minutes
15,
compared to like hours of doing it with real users.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea is basically to have a tool that lets you kind of rewind time and kind of query for your users to find specific use cases that that you can see maybe in your Google Analytics, like some part of your conversion funnel is broken.
Mm-hmm.
But Google Analytics doesn't tell you, or most analytics products, they don't tell you how to fix it. They just tell you that it's broken. And then you either have to like do user tests or A/B tests. A/B tests are, I think, even worse, because you basically have to, you just guess randomly.
Yeah.
Eventually you might find an answer. And that just seems, again, very slow. You have to like put in code, build stuff before you even know that it works. And you have to wait a month to get the results. And then you decide that, okay, that was not worth it, compared to, if you could just see 30 people using it. I think that the brain so far is a much better pattern matching machine than a computer. So the idea is basically it'll record user activity on your product, and then let you query for specific pieces to let you to let you improve that part of the user experience.
So is it literally recording user activity? You could just see what they were seeing, or is it based?
Yep.
Okay, that's really cool.
Yep.
And is that something that other people aren't doing right now?
So there's a few companies that are doing it as well, like Full Story or Inspectlit, or if you just Google, like, I don't know, track user software, mm-hmm. You'll find a bunch of them.
Yeah.
But the thing that we want to do is actually integrate into the entire. So we don't just see it as just for user testing. We see it as being like every interaction that a customer ever has with you. Mm-hmm. You should have in the same place so that you can find like correlations, right? So, right, like all of the other competitors that exist so far, I don't know of any that actually tie into, for example, your support functionality or your your sales functionality, so that you can see, like, you can ask questions like, show me videos of people just before they unsubscribed. Mm-hmm. Show me videos of people that talk to this support person, or aggregate users by which support person they talk to and what's the conversion rate of each support person, and let me see a few sample videos of people talking to the support person. Mm-hmm. And so the idea is, if you put all of the data in one place, you should be able to make much stronger predictions about what to do with your business to make it better.
Right. Is this something you're planning to keep for internal use, or trying to create like a product out of it?
So it's going to be available externally as well, but okay. the first customer is ParseHub.
Nice.
Yeah.
So for ParseHub itself, what kind of customers do you typically find you're getting, and what are they doing with it?
Sure. So a large part of our use case is like e-commerce. Mm-hmm. There's companies that want to make sure that their goods aren't being knocked off, and so they'll scrape a bunch of e-commerce sites to make sure that anything that's advertised with their branding is actually their product. Mm-hmm. Similarly, there's companies that want to they have a minimal advertised price policy. So, for example, like Apple famously does not allow retailers to sell for less than 10% below the advertised price. Mm-hmm. There's other companies that do that as well, and so they want to monitor to make sure that the pricing policies are being, they're basically verifying that their retailers are complying. There's people that just want to scrape just the pricing information of various e-commerce sites just to aggregate it, right? So they have maybe internal uses. So, you want to price competitively. Let's say, like, when Amazon has a sale, I want to price, 1 cent under what they're pricing at.
Right.
Yeah, so we have a lot of e-commerce use cases. We have other aggregators that use this. So, for example, let's say you want to build a database of all of the used cars for sale in the world.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that's not available today because you have a bunch of different websites that people list on, and so you want to basically get all of them and kind of put them in one place. Or let's say you want to get all of the antibodies that have been discovered. That's also something that is not easy to do because there's a bunch of little labs that basically people will discover things and sell them.
Mm-hmm.
But like there's not one place where you can go to get that kind of information.
Right.
We've had an interesting use case, for example, was in Brazil. There's journalists using it to fight corruption from the government, where the government will claim that the inflation rate is so and so, and then journalists will actually scrape real products from companies that are selling them and find like the true inflation rate. So there's some exciting things going on there.
That's really cool. How did you find out about, like, do you know what all of these customers are doing with it on an individual basis?
So I know some of them.
Uh-huh.
Again, my role within ParseHub is not as active now as it once used to be.
Yeah.
I'm still at the office every day, but I don't talk to customers as often anymore. So I no longer know them all by name.
Yeah. Did you start ParseHub on your own?
So I started it with a co-founder about four years ago.
Okay. And was that straight out of school?
No, so I did a different product out of school. It's called DebugX, and actually the name of the company is DebugX. ParseHub is like the product.
Mm-hmm.
So DebugX is basically this product that I don't know if you're familiar with what a regular expression is.
Yep.
So it's basically like a Control F on steroids, right? So when you search an article, you can Control F will let you search for like a specific word, but if you want to do something like give me all of the dates in the article,
mm-hmm.
do that with Control F. So a regular expression is basically like you can type out different patterns and find all of them in a piece of text.
Yep.
And the problem with them is that if they can get really big and complicated and ugly, and then it's really hard to find out why they're not matching the thing that they're supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
And so DebugX is this tool that you can basically plug in a regular expression and a piece of text and kind of walk through how the regular expression matches that specific piece of text.
Mm-hmm.
So you can go step by step into the pattern, right? So for a date, it might be like match 4 digits for the year, and then there's a hyphen, and then match 2 digits for the date. And so you can step through each individual chunk to see why it's matching or not matching correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was basically, so when I was in school, I basically kept track of like things that were broken in the world I thought I had a reasonable chance of fixing.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I graduated, I kind of like looked at that list, and my criteria was like, what's something small enough that I could go through an entire business cycle, right? So I could like build a product, market it, sell it, like maintain it for a while, that I could do all by myself. Because when I graduated, it was just me. I didn't have any co-founders.
Mm-hmm.
And so DebugX was basically this product that I thought I could build by myself. I had a reasonable chance of making money selling it, and it was small enough that I could do it by myself. It turns out I couldn't make any money selling it, but I spent about 4 or 5 months on that before switching to ParseHub.
Did you try to sell it and just realize that there wasn't a market for it?
Actually, about 2 months after I launched it on Hacker News and Reddit, and it got, at the time it was like it was on the top page of Reddit for our programming, and so I got quite a bit of traffic initially. Didn't really do any marketing other than that, but there was basically a company that just randomly came along and agreed to pay me $4,000 for a license, and without me having to do like anything. So I thought maybe there's something here. And so I spent a couple more months on it, and it turns out that was like the only customer in the world that won. And I'm quite sure there's other customers there, but the effort to acquire them is just too high for what it's worth.
Yeah.
And so I basically, I looked at DebugX and what people were using it for, and like 80% of people were using it for web scraping, which is not that is not the correct way to do web scraping, but people were using it anyways. And so I started working on ParseHub.
So it kind of morphed into ParseHub. I guess you learned something about what people were doing with it, even though they weren't using it the way you expected.
Yep. So actually, both of those sorry. So ParseHub was on my list from before DebugX.
Okay.
But DebugX was kind of a confirmation that like, hey, people are actually have a need for web scraping. I have a story about how both of those came along initially. So when I was in university in about second year, a few friends and we decided to build a hedge fund, and the idea was, we were all very good programmers. A friend of mine, he was on the IOI, won I think bronze medal, won the CCC, got gold medal every year. So quite a strong team. And the idea was, it would be easier to, if you're a strong programmer, it'd be easier to learn the finance stuff and get good at that than a finance guy, someone who's good at finance, to learn the engineering. And so, by the way, for anybody who doesn't know what a hedge fund is, it's basically a company that tries to like make money by trading stocks. And so our hypothesis was like, we could win, like the way we'd get an advantage is just by out engineering the finance guys, right? So we'd basically, be able to make decisions faster, use more data to make decisions, and anything that we could use to get an engineering edge. That would be how would we compete against the market. And so there's kind of like two paths that we were pursuing internally at the time. One was the idea of like a black box approach. So the catchphrase we had internally was like, we'd turn on a computer and it would just make us some money. And it never ended up making us any money. But at the time we had some, this was around 2009, 2010. So before the developments in deep learning that are as of 2012. And so we had some what we thought was better than the state of the art at the time for reading news articles and understanding what they're talking about. And the idea was, we'd feed in like 1 million news articles a day and read them and kind of like understand what they're saying a little bit, and based on that, like make trades based on what was read in the articles. And the second approach we had was basically, like a white box approach. So, if instead of just turning on a computer that would make us money, we thought, like there's the hedge funds today, they have like 50 analysts working to just like find out answers to some questions, because the data is so like, it's just so hard to get at. And so how can we leverage a single person so that they're as powerful as 50 people, right? Because if we could give them a lot of leverage, then they could, then we could actually compete against the other hedge funds without having as much capital. And so our idea for what we could do to give a single human extreme leverage is basically the idea of a joint operator on the internet. So to explain that a little bit, I don't know if you're familiar with Bloomberg. So Bloomberg is a company that basically is in the business of selling all kinds of data. So like they mostly focus on financial data, but they have all kinds of data on their platform. So they have like 20 or 30,000 different, they call them screens. And so a screen is basically a view on a data set. So you might have like a stock screen that shows you like all of the stocks. You might have like a company's screen that shows you all companies, public and private. You might have an options screen that shows you what options are available. You have a shipping screen that shows you like, on a map, every single ship in the world and what it's carrying and from what country to what port to what other port. And so they have a ton of different data, but the problem is that all of it is kind of like siloed into this screen. So if I wanted to say, show me all of the companies that are carrying more than X amount of coal from China to Brazil that also have a valuation of more than 50 billion and have options expiring at blah date that are selling under some formula. Basically, that question, if you want to answer it, you have to manually export the data and have engineers work with it or analysts work with it to kind of like join it all together to even ask those kind of questions.
So you could just get the answer to one of those questions, like give me all the ships that are carrying coal or something like that? Okay.
Exactly. So you could answer like within a specific silo of data, you could ask questions, but you couldn't join across them. And so the idea was if you could do this join operator and visualize the answers, that we would have a significant edge, because for each data set, like every time somebody wants to ask a question in Bloomberg, they have to go through this process of like, again, unless they have a very like niche question where it's kind of answerable within a single domain, which I think most interesting questions are not like that. then you had to do this. Like you basically had to have people pull data manually and join it together.
Mm-hmm.
And so we thought if we could have an automated way of doing that, that would be a significant amount of leverage. And so the second approach, this white box approach, was like, can we just scrape all the data on the internet and organize it in such a way that you could query across different data sets easily? Yeah, and so both of those didn't work. And the reason was our hypothesis was, we would out-engineer the finance guys, and it turns out we were spending like 85% of our time just doing manual data gathering and cleanup, which was not a good use of our skills at all, but it had to be done, and it took a long time to do.
Mm-hmm.
And we looked on the market at the time. There was a few tools available to help with that kind of stuff, but they all sucked. And so that's when I wrote down both regular expressions and web scraping on my list. And when I graduated in 2013, I looked at that list again and I was like, okay, these all the tools on the market still suck.
Yeah.
And so we decided to build something more powerful.
Interesting. So, I mean, the hedge fund thing sounds like a really interesting idea. It sounds like you had a really great team too. So you think it didn't work because the tools you needed weren't available at the time?
Oh, so it's just we were deleveraged, right? Like our whole premise is like if we can use our engineering skills, we can, if a hedge fund has 50 people and we have 4,
Mm-hmm.
We can still compete against that.
Yeah.
But the problem was, the hedge fund has 50 people and we're spending 85% of our time not engineering, right? We're spending 5% of our time doing like stuff that is not giving us a real advantage. It just has to be done. And so it was just like there's no way that we thought we could beat the market with that.
Right. So your advantage existed, you just couldn't exploit it, I guess.
Yes.
Okay. So I saw on your LinkedIn that you went to the University of Waterloo, which explains why you went through all those internships and stuff. What was it like working at Facebook and Google and companies like that?
So I think it's very, I guess, I encourage everybody in university to, go to as many different places to work at as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Basically get to diff all of them, right? So you can kind of like go to your first one and then go to your second one, go to your third one, see what the differences were between them, and then see, you can kind of get a sense of like which pieces are helpful to building a company or to running a company, which pieces are not helpful. And I think after you graduate, there's this kind of stigma if you have anything on your resume shorter than like, a year or two. And when you're an intern is that time where you basically for free can go and explore a bunch of different options.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that was really valuable. In fact, my biggest regret at the time was I took 2 internships at the same place. I don't think I should have done that.
But after interning at these companies, you were sure you wanted to work on your own company?
Yeah, I don't think there was ever any other plan. From very early on, I was always like building stuff on my own, not trying to sell it initially, but like I would build like games and like things to just kind of like see if people like them.
Yeah.
So I don't think there was ever. I don't think I ever had the idea of like you go to a 9-to-5 job and work for the rest of your life. I don't think that was ever in my. I don't remember ever having thought of myself as doing that.
Okay, but you were doing that on your internships. So did you like it? Did you hate it? Were you learning or?
So I think with internships, you have like every new job. I think you have about a 3-week learning curve where it's very steep, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where like today you come in and then you learn a ton of new stuff.
Yeah.
And then after about 3 weeks, it plateaus because it's just like you've learned all the stuff that's new about this company and interesting about this company. And then after that, it's just like just
you're doing work.
Yep, exactly.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. And then presumably you were working in California.
Yep.
So when you wanted to do your startup, did you think of going there at all?
I mean, so people have suggested it, but I think it's a bad idea. I guess that is the contrarian belief because everybody else seems to think that you must go there. But I think it's just it's very, very overpriced, right? Like I think pretty much anybody can build a business that's more profitable than if they were to get a job if they have about 5 years to build a business. So it's like you can do it in a year, but you have to get lucky.
Yeah.
But if you have 5 years, you don't need to get lucky. You can just you can get maximally unlucky, and you can still build a profitable business.
Mm-hmm.
And going to California would have cut my savings down from being able to live for 7 or 8 years down to being able to live for half a year.
Mm-hmm.
And so it just did not make sense at all.
How'd you save up that money from your internships?
Yeah, so internships are pretty good at Waterloo,
Yeah.
and also I lived with my parents, so the savings I did have went a long way
Yeah.
because my parents let me live in their basement for
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. It seems like the reason most startups fail is because they quit too early,
Yep.
Within 1 year or 2 years, which is that point where you're not really making money anyway.
Yep.
So when did you kind of cross that bridge with ParseHub, where it's like, okay, this will actually work?
So we launched it in September 2014,
Mm-hmm.
and then we became profitable where we were able to hire our first other employee, and pay for all the founders' living expenses. Sorry, we had another founder join after the two of us started
Okay.
launching. But basically in March of 2016, we hired our first employee. So I guess after launching, but we had built it for a year before that.
Mm-hmm.
So
Two
two and a
years?
half after the first line of code was written,
Mm-hmm.
we hired our first employee.
Nice. Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yep. And another thing about going to California and shortening your, I guess going to California is not the only way you can shorten your runway,
Yeah.
right? Like if you have a high cost of living, like if you prefer going out, or if you have dependents,
Mhm.
right? Those are all pretty tough. Like anything that shortens your runway is hard.
Yeah.
But I think if you put yourself in a position where you're forced to raise money, that is how you lose negotiations, is if you can't walk away. So I think for that reason, it's also not great.
Yeah. Have you guys raised money, or did you ever think about or try raising money?
We've gotten a few. I mean, so sorry. We personally, the two of us that started the company, personally put in $1,000 for the first batch of servers that we needed.
Okay.
Other than that, there's been no money going into the company. We've had a few offers, but it's just I'm personally quite cynical about investors.
Mm-hmm.
The reason is because there's just a complete misalignment of interests, right? Like if you look at it from the founder's perspective, pretty much 100% of their net worth is in this thing that they're doing.
Yep.
And so it's basically like an all-in move. Whereas for the investor, they have a portfolio of 100 companies, and so their investment in you represents 1% of their portfolio.
Mm-hmm.
So the decisions that they're gonna want your startup to make are going to be very different than the decisions that you're going to want your company to make.
Yeah.
And so that misalignment of interests means that as a founder, you should charge a high premium for causing that misalignment. And there wasn't anybody willing to pay a high enough premium.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there are a lot of companies that get destroyed because they get investors. They start saying that we want to change leadership, or their goal is to just make a quick buck.
Yep,
Yeah.
there's horror stories all over the internet.
So when you realized, I guess, that Debug X is not gonna fly,
Yep.
is that the point where, how did you end up meeting your co-founder or start working with your co-founder?
So I met him in my first year of university,
Okay.
and we just kept in touch. We were good friends by the end of school,
Mm-hmm.
and we just talked one day. I was like, "Hey, this might be a good idea." Okay, okay.
Was he working on something as well, or was he working at a company?
So he was working at a different company, also a startup, and he really did not like it because it was so the startup that he was working on was not making any money, and they did raise funding.
Mm-hmm.
And the founder was not a technical founder, so there's a lot of mistakes being made, both on the business side and on the technical side. So he was very, I think, unhappy there.
Okay. So it wasn't hard to convince him to quit.
It was not hard. I think he initiated the conversation.
So he was ready to quit.
Yeah.
And then how did your third co-founder join the company?
She was working on a different startup of her own, and again, she's been a friend since like childhood. I met her, I think, in like grade 5 or something.
Okay.
And so she was working on that, and then we kept in touch, and eventually I convinced her that she should join us. She was having trouble finding engineers, so I think it would have been harder for her to succeed without that.
Right. That's pretty cool. So, all of your co-founders, I guess, then know each other pretty well. And then how many people are working there now?
So we have 10 people.
And was it hard building out that team?
So initially, yeah, because it's just like you're competing with Google, and you want the best engineers.
Yeah.
And so you have to take drastic steps to do that. So, for example, I am not the CEO anymore. I gave up that position, one, because, it's kind of a multiplicative effect, right? So if I can train somebody else to be a strong CEO, mm-hmm. and at the same time I can take another product and, be a strong, I don't know if I'm a strong CEO, but if I can develop myself to be a good CEO there, mm-hmm. Then you now have 2 good CEOs. And so that seems better than just having one. Yeah. And then the second is that part of the condition of him becoming CEO is that he'd be retained for 4 years. And so, that is, I think, a good deal on both sides. And I should mention that he was an intern this summer before he became CEO. So, yeah.
So you weren't kidding when you said drastic, huh?
I was not kidding, no.
Was that a hard thing to do?
I don't think it was that hard. I think I'm generally quite I just kind of optimize on the logical path, and that seemed like the logical thing to do. So I didn't lose sleep over that decision.
Seems like a really tough thing to do, but I guess, I don't know, it's also too easy to get hung up over titles and things like that.
Yep.
Do you guys ever have problems in terms of like dividing ownership or shares or whatever, things like that?
So we have a very, we did initially, and then I wrote a handbook to kind of explain how and why we make decisions the way we do. Mm-hmm. We basically run under a benevolent dictator model, where like for any single decision, should have a single decision maker. There shouldn't be like we have a one of our rules is committees suck.
Okay.
So we don't have committees, right? Because if you have committees or multiple people that are responsible for a decision, mm-hmm. the problem is that both credit and blame get diluted, and then also the fact that you have to come to some sort of agreement. There's just a cost to that, right? Yeah. Like it's essentially like a mutex on your organization that every decision has to be approved by multiple people.
Yeah.
It's just expensive. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, like you can make decisions way faster and you can kind of properly credit and blame people for you can keep score of how well people are making decisions.
Yeah.
If every decision has a single person responsible for it. And I guess the benevolent part is basically the person who's responsible for whatever decision should request as much input as they need to feel confident that they're making the right decision. Mm-hmm. Right. So it's not like you just make random decisions and what you say goes. It's like you should be correct.
Well, your goal is to be correct.
Yes.
And how do you decide who makes what decision?
It's basically like we try to give people chances, and if they're good, then they just keep getting more decisions that they make. I think that makes sense.
Yeah. Seems like an interesting culture. Different from like what most people are probably used to.
Yep. Yeah, it's just like very, very intentional. Like no decision or there's a few decisions that should have multiple people, but almost every decision, at least on a day-to-day basis, should be like there's a single person that decides.
Yeah. So what's the day-to-day like at your company and for you?
So a lot of it is a grind, right? Like any company that you're building, it's mm-hmm. like there's a lot of stuff to do and you just got to get it done. So we try to like splice in some fun in between there. Like we have board game nights every Friday. we're going to do, for the first time, we're going to do a ski trip this year. But a lot of it is grind because it's hard to build a company.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So where do you see kind of like this is like an interview question, I guess, but what do you see like the future of this?
Sure. So there's basically in kind of like any data processing pipeline, you have so this is going back to our hedge fund, to the hedge fund story that I told earlier.
Mm-hmm.
There's kind of ParseHub is only one piece, right? So one of the things that we struggled with it just happened to be the first thing was that we couldn't extract the data.
Mm-hmm.
It just like took a lot of work, but that's not the end, right? So ParseHub is basically it takes the stuff on the web
Mm-hmm.
that's human readable and makes it machine readable, but that is not good enough yet to like make decisions off of, right? Because for example, if you have errors in the source data, like the website has an error, there's no way that ParseHub can know that there's an error. There has to be some sort of like, that error will be present in the output of ParseHub. Also formatting, right? So let's say you want to take data from ParseHub and combine it with data from somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
You need those two pieces of data to be in kind of like some sort of consistent format so that you can make them talk to each other. And so there's basically a tool that's missing in the market today, I think, that basically does really powerful transformations between data and then talks to different APIs, right? Like if you look at Excel, it kind of fits this niche where Excel was built 30 or 40 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It was based on the kind of like the file model of moving data around, right? Like you have a file, you send it to somebody, and they do something and move it around.
Mm-hmm.
And so you start with a snapshot of data, you type in some formulas into your Excel sheet, and then you have a snapshot output that that you send to somebody. The problem is that I know people working at large consumer goods companies that their job every Monday is to redo Excel sheets that are just to get those formulas to act on new snapshots of data. And so the way I see a tool that's built today, it would know not about files, but it would kind of understand streams of data.
Mm-hmm.
And APIs, right? So you should be able to say like go to Gmail, and every time I receive an email from a customer, add that to some database, and then go to ParseHub and input that user into LinkedIn and get some data from there. And basically like you kind of like you move data around as part of a pipeline rather than as just snapshots, right? So you would type some formulas, and then all the data that goes through from some service to some other service would pass through those formulas, kind of without needing manual updates.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the first missing piece. And then the second missing piece is on the visualization side. So if you look at something like Tableau or Excel, actually Brett Victor has really good talks on this. If you Google Brett Victor,
okay,
you can look at it. But there's basically to visualize some data, you kind of have a few options today that are kind of at different points of a triangle. So on one point of the triangle, you have something like Photoshop, right, where it's a very direct medium, like very intuitive to create stuff in, because it's like just manipulate the pixels. It's very similar to like drawing, and you can make a custom picture, right? So you can make the picture that best tells the story that you want your data to tell. But the problem with Photoshop is like it doesn't update, right? So if I update my data, now I need to sit down for 5 hours and draw a new picture, and that's not a very good model. And then on another side of the triangle, you have something like programming, where it's like you can make it exactly the way you want, and it updates immediately, but it's not a direct medium, right? So it's not like putting pixels where you want them to be. It's like you have a wall of hieroglyphics, and then that kind of like maps somehow to the picture, but changing the picture is not at all obvious from like what you have to change in the text, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like people, as a human, you've evolved to have a very large visual cortex because it just is very useful. But if a tiger is running at you, to be able to perceive where they are and how fast they're going, etc., is just very useful for your survival.
Mm-hmm.
In comparison, you have very weak like symbolic reasoning skills, and so the idea that people make visualizations in this like language that's symbolic just seems very backwards, right? Like people should be, if you're making visualizations, you should be working like 95% of your time should be playing with pictures. And same with like making decisions, right? Like you should get people to think in pictures as often as possible, because your brain is just way better at reasoning about pictures than it is about words. And so programming is the other side of that triangle, and then somewhere in the middle, it's not at a point, is something like Excel or Tableau, where it'll update immediately, but and it's reasonably easy to use, right? Like you kind of like select some columns and rows, and you just like insert chart and then choose a chart. But the problem is that there's only like 10 charts, right? Yeah. So those charts are kind of chosen, and with Tableau it's maybe like 20 charts, right? The problem is that those charts kind of like on average across all types of data, they'll be an okay representation of they'll tell the story of your data in an okay way. But the problem is that for any specific instance, none of those 10 charts are the best way to show that data.
Yeah.
And so what you want, and I think there's room here, room in the market for this, is something like Photoshop that kind of like updates automatically, right? Where you can like draw the picture that you want, and the drawings are just linked to some data. I think CAD is also kind of in the space where, just your drawings have some measurements and stuff attached to them. But again, it doesn't update automatically. I think that will, like, if I look in 20 years, how will people be making decisions? I think it's obvious that they'll, like, almost everything will be either AI based or picture based. I think it's quite silly to write programs to make pictures.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. I want to ask you, how do you decide whether to hire people? Because based on everything you said, I can't imagine you have a normal process.
We always have a list of things to do that is way bigger than the amount of people that we have, the amount of resources that we have to do it. So our process is basically like set a very high bar for people that we will hire, and then anybody who meets that bar we hire, as long as we have enough money to pay them. So by the way, we became profitable in December of 2015, or in March 2016, sorry. In December we became profitable, but we hired our first employee in March. But we haven't actually taken any profit out of the company, so we basically spend it back to reinvest it into the company, basically every chance we get. And we expect to do so for like the next 20 years or so. Yeah, so that's basically it. It's just like set a very high bar and then hire anybody that meets the bar if you can.
How do you know they meet the bar, though?
So we try to have hard interviews, I guess. And we've so at the beginning when hiring the very first person, I basically went through, like, I had a reasonably good intuitive understanding of how strong each of my friends were. And so I went through all of my friends, kind of like knowing how skilled they were and how or unskilled they were, and asked them a bunch of different questions. And then I tried to find the ones that most correlate to my understanding of how skilled they are. And that seems to have worked quite well for us so far.
Interesting.
But this only applies for developers, so I don't actually know how to do that for non-developer positions yet.
Yeah. How many technical versus non-technical people do you guys have?
So we have 8 developers and 2 support/sales.
Got it. And you're saying your plan is to continue to reinvest for the next 20 years? How do you know what's going to happen in 20 years?
I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm pretty certain that the investment, the growth of the company will exceed the growth of the S&P for 20 years. And so as long as that's true, it's probably a good investment. In general, I think having gone through the hedge fund, my stance on investing now is basically not to invest in anything that I can't control the outcome of, and playing a close role in the company. I think I have a significant amount of influence on the outcome of the company. And so I think it's a reasonably good investment.
Yeah. Do you feel like that changes as the company grows? That your influence kind of becomes a smaller percentage of the overall company?
So again, it's not so much about like my individual contribution becomes smaller, right? But It's like, if something is broken, then I know that I can take steps to fix it.
Yeah.
Right. And in general, things are always broken. So even at the big companies that I worked at, just their core stuff works well, but then anything at the edges is just completely broken.
Yeah.
The same way with like when we were 3 people, it's like the stuff that we were, that we thought was really important, we were good at. But that was a very small amount of the stuff that we had in total. Right.
Yeah.
So everything breaks or is broken at the edges. Right, so this doesn't just apply to code where like our servers go down or like our logging is broken or whatever. It also applies to like processes, right? So like your processes for communication, the ones that worked for 3 people will no longer work at 8 people.
Yeah.
But it's just like there's too many people now, so it doesn't work. Like we have we have a meeting that we have with the company every Tuesday. Right, it kind of works. It worked well when it was 5 people.
Yeah.
It works less well when there's 10 people. I imagine it won't work. At least the format that it's in right now, we're kind of, almost everybody gets a chance to say something. That will not work for 30 people, right? Because it'll take way too long, and a lot of it is like, even now we're seeing that like people are starting to talk about like random details that are not that important to other people, and so basically everything, like every time you double or triple the number of things that are in some process, just things break, right? Like when we had 10 servers, our deployment script was like, just like SSH into every machine and start the process. And that took like 10 minutes maybe to do a deployment. And then when you have 100 servers, that means that if you fix a bug and you need to get it into production immediately, now you have to wait 2 hours. And so that's no longer a good process. And so just like everything breaks as you get bigger. And so I expect that to continue happening, but I also expect to be able to continue fixing them as they break.
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. I think if you grow organically, then you continue to learn how to fix things as they break, as opposed to, if someone suddenly gives you like $10 million and you try to grow way quicker than you really should.
So I can't really comment on that because I haven't been through that. But yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. Last thing I want to ask you is something I kind of ask everybody I talk to, which is if you had one piece of advice for anyone thinking about getting into entrepreneurship.
Okay.
What would you tell them?
I would tell them to start. I think a lot of people. So I have friends who like they often will talk to me about like ideas and like things that they think would be cool to have as a customer or whatever, but they never take like it's very easy to find a reason to say no.
Yeah.
Right, because it's like, oh, it's too risky, or you can find all kinds of reasons to say no.
Yeah.
Or like, I can't do it, I'm not qualified, blah blah blah. But if you start, then you can kind of like pick up all the skills that you need along the way. And if you're bored at work, the fastest, right? So one of the excuses I hear is like, oh, I should spend 5 years in industry, and that way I can build connections, and that way I'll have a higher chance when I do start, right? But the rate that you're making connections by working in a regular job is much slower than the rate that you'd be making new connections by building a company. In general, I think if you want to do something, you should start, but make sure you have enough runway that you will have time to pivot if your first idea doesn't work out, because in all likelihood it will not work out.
Yeah, sounds like you followed your own advice, which is usually a good sign for whether you should actually listen to someone's advice or not. So
yes.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's a good place to end, unless there's anything else you want to add or tell people to check out or anything like that.
I mean, check out ParseHub. It's parsehub.com. I have to shamelessly plug the product.
Yeah, no, you should. I mean, that's kind of the point of this. I benefit by learning from you. You hopefully benefit by us driving some people there, and the people listening to this hopefully learn something, get inspired. Who knows? Get entertained. Yep. Awesome. Thanks a lot for doing this. It was really, really cool talking to you.
Cool. Thanks, Akash.
That's it for the podcast. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. I really feel like I learned a lot talking to Serge and hearing his perspective on stuff. One thing I really want to highlight is what he said about venture capital and raising money. The idea that you don't want to put yourself in a position where you're forced to raise money is really interesting. And like he said, that's when you lose negotiations, when you can't walk away. And I think a lot of founders are under the impression that you have to raise money in order to build a successful startup. I know I've been obsessed with that idea just because it seems like the thing you're supposed to do, but it's really not necessary and may in fact even be detrimental. And what he said about the misalignment of values and interests really struck a chord with me because it's true. For an investor, you're one of 100 investments that they have. But for you, your startup is your life. You have to think about that when you're getting investment. And that's why I think it's not just a cliche when people say it's not just about the money when you're taking investment. It's really about the person you're taking that investment from. Do you really trust that they have the best interests of you and your company at heart? Pretty interesting thing to think about. Anyways, thank you again for listening. If you have any questions, comments, concerns about the podcast, if you want to be on the podcast, if you want to listen to more podcasts, please check out engineeringastartup.com. You can also reach out on Twitter at enginehire. If you're feeling like you want to help the podcast, the best way to do that is definitely to tell a friend about it. Just share this episode with them if you think they'll find it interesting. Another cool thing you could do is leave a review on iTunes. That seems to really help get this out to more people. Anyways, keep thinking. What will you create?